Alright, what's up guys? I had an idea for another video, and also for this video I had to show my entire, desktop, which is why you saw the OBS in the beginning. This is my beautiful desktop. Um, Now it's clean. It's a nice, clean, beautiful desktop. But the idea of this video was I was just going to do some general research on bleeding, since there is only 6 days until we hit Scourge League. I do have my fan blowing a little bit. It's pretty hot outside right now, so, I got my fan going. If it's picking up in the microphone, I'm not turning it off, so you all are going to have to get used to it. But this was just doing some general research on bleeding before the league starts. That way I would have an idea of what type of gear to get, and on the passive tree, what type of nodes I should be looking for, if that makes sense. So I looked up bleeding. I actually, right here in the search bar, I typed in Path of Exile and then bleed. And that took me over here to Google, which has this that says bleeding. It's from Fandom, and I just clicked on it. So this is everything about bleeding. The first line says that it's an ailment. So bleeding, excuse me. Bleeding or bleed is an ailment that deals physical damage over time. So I'm going to write that down in my notepad. This is going to be for the Bleed Bow Gladiator. Am I playing Gladiator or am I going Rupture? No, I'm playing Gladiator. Okay, so Bleed Bow Gladiator. So bleed does physical damage over time. Does physical damage over time. There we go. So it does physical damage over time to the affected target. Moving targets suffer increased bleeding damage. So moving targets take increased damage. Cool. Let's write that down. Moving targets take increased damage. Only physical damage can inflict bleed. That's great to know. Only physical damage can inflict bleed. Only phys can inflict bleed. That is great to know. As of current build of the game, all chances to bleed are granted to the weapon as a local mod, or the chance is specific to the attack. Thus, bleed is limited to attack skills only at the moment. So you cannot get bleed from spells. So bleed only from attacks. It's good to know. I'm pretty sure I went over in one of the other videos about the difference of bleed, not bleed, the difference of attacks and spells. Things that say attack damage or increases to attack will not affect spells, and you could look at the gem, which I'll go into a little bit later. So these are the mechanics. Let's go on to how do I inflict bleed. Infliction. Attack will inflict one application of bleed if base damage of attack have non-zero physical component. The base damage of an attack has a non-zero physical component. I don't know what that means. Has a non-zero physical component. I don't know what that means. But attack successfully lands, so it's not blocked, dodged, or evaded. Of course, you gotta hit your target to inflict bleed, which is accuracy. We're gonna need accuracy. Attack has a chance to cause bleeding, and if it passes the chance check. Oh, so chance to bleed is another one. Of course, we're going to need 100% chance to bleed. 100% chance to bleed is needed. There we go. And different applications of bleed are inflicted independently. So basically, if I'm going to be running with Rain of Arrows, one arrow might hit, and if that arrow crits, it's going to do a separate bleed compared to an arrow that hit and didn't crit. So every application is independent. Every person, especially with Rain of Arrows, when the arrows hit, the number and the damages are going to be different on each minion that you hit. It's fair enough. Apart from dealing damage, the bleeding state, presence of bleed stacks, can interact with other mechanics. Is that right? The golden rule. So you get 40%, well 30% increased armor while bleeding. Bleeding you inflict is reflected to you, and then 1% to chaos resistance per poison on you. Poison you inflict is reflected to you if you have fewer than 100 poisons on you. So this will give you extra armor while you're bleeding, but it will also give you chaos resistance per poison up to 100. 100% chaos resistance actually sounds pretty dope. What is this? Double strike. And like I was saying before about the gem tags, at the very top left, you will read it says double strike, and below it you'll see 4 words. One says attack, one says melee, one says strike, one says physical. Those are called gem tags. This is an attack. It is not a spell. It is a melee attack, meaning that you could use them with weapons. Weapons like swords, axes, maybe even staffs. It's a strike, so you run up and hit them. It's not a far away attack, and it deals physical damage. Cool. But what does this say? It deals 91.3 to 112% of base attack damage, and it adds 3 to 13 to 5 to 169 physical damage against bleeding enemies. It also comes with a 25% chance to cause bleeding. That seems pretty dope. And it gives, 0 to +2 melee strike range, which just means that you could stand further back and hit your enemies. It's pretty dope. And hemophilia. Strength, increased damage over time, which is what bleed does. It does damage over time. Chance to bleed. We're going to need bleed chance. Increased attack damage against bleeding enemies. 40%. Pretty decent amount. Bleeding enemies you kill explode, dealing 5% of their maximum life is physical damage. That's dope. You get explosions, and each explosion deals its own damage. Cool. 25% reduced bleeding duration. So that just means that they're not going to bleed for as long. Alright, damage. Bleed deals physical damage over time. Okay, we know that. It does damage over time. Do we have damage over time? Bleed deals physical damage over time, or just generic damage over time. These are things we're going to look for on the tree, or on gear, or whatever is going to be physical damage over time, or damage over time. Cool. Potential damage from one bleed application is based on the physical damage of attack that caused it. So the physical damage from the attack that caused that bleed, 70% per second if the target is standing still. So it will take, bleed will take a percentage of your hit damage, I'm going to say. And it will convert that hit damage into bleed damage. So basically, the harder that you hit, the stronger that bleed application will be. So we're going to need just generic physical damage also. Since bleed is only caused by physical damage, we need to find physical damage on gear. That is what we're looking for. So as of right now, for this Bleed Bow Gladiator on gear and stuff, we're going to look for physical damage over time damage over time, and physical damage. Cool. We're also going to look for 100% chance to bleed. That's another thing we're going to be looking for. If the target is moving, bleeding deals additional damage equal to twice the base. So it will deal double damage if the enemy is moving. Twice the damage as the base, for a total of 3 times the base damage. Wait. It deals additional damage equal to twice the base, so it deals 3 times the base damage. Okay, so triple damage for moving enemies. That's a good one. Triple damage for moving enemies. It's very nice to know. If they're moving, you get triple damage. So that tells me I'm going to want to stay away from things like freeze or anything that will slow them down or make them stop moving. We want them to be moving for triple damage. Awesome. So by default, only the strongest, the highest damage per second bleed application will actually deal damage at any given time. So the strongest hit will deal the damage. So if you attack 3 times in 1 second, only the strongest hit out of those 3 bleeds applications will deal the damage, which is great because it will always roll the highest bleed. I think that's awesome until the bleed runs out. And if your enemy's not dead when the bleed runs out and you hit them again, the highest DPS bleed will do the damage. I think that's awesome. If Crimson Dance is allocated, the potential damage of 1 stack is 35% of the inflicting attack's physical damage. So Crimson Dance will only give you 35%, but then it's regardless of whether the target is moving or not. So this is, the Crimson Dance is a way to, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a, you'll get bleed damage at a steady rate. It's consistent, that's the word I'm looking for. Crimson Dance will give you more consistent bleeds, I guess. They may be, they're going to be less damage bleeds, but you will always get the same amount of bleeds depending on, you know, the amount that was inflicted, but you'll always get that 35%, which you're kind of losing damage right here, but you get 8 stacks. It says regardless of whether the target is moving or not, and the 8 strongest applications will deal damage at any given time. So the Crimson Dance could be an option for us to spec into, depending on our attack speed. If we can attack 8 times before the boss is dead, or if we're able to attack 8 times on, let's say, general enemies, I guess we'll be having more consistent damage. Sustaining all 8 stacks on one target will thus deal 280% of the attack's average physical damage per second. Yeah, but if we're not keeping them alive long enough to build up 8 stacks, or if it is taking 8 stacks actually to kill, let's just say a regular mob, you might actually be losing. But this is something we can experiment with when the league starts. So let's do Crimson Dance. 8 stacks are required. 8 stacks required. Crimson Dance. Cool. So it does, what does it say? It says sustaining all 8 stacks on a target will thus deal an additional 280% of the attack's average physical damage per second. This effectively quadruples bleed DPS and prolonged fights. Okay, so when it comes to things like bossing, from what this is saying, if you get 8 stacks and you sustain all 8 stacks of bleed on your boss, you will be doing more damage than 3 times. This will give you triple damage. Just regular bleed on a moving target is triple damage, while Crimson Dance will give you quadruple at 8 stacks, which sounds great. 8 stacks required for quad damage. Cool. And then triple damage for moving enemies. That is pretty good. I actually didn't know that before. That Crimson Dance has the potential to out DPS a regular moving bleed. But building the 8 stacks and keeping the 8 stacks is probably going to have to do a lot with duration. How long will your bleed last? Will your bleed last? Because if you're only gaining 5 stacks of bleed and it runs out before you can get to 8 stacks, then you're going to be losing damage. So I have a feeling that bleed duration is going to be a huge one if we're going to even think about using Crimson Dance. So let's put down bleed duration, because we know that bleed can be reduced from the hemophilia gloves we saw up here in Pharaoh's Pounce, but hemophilia will give you 25% reduced bleed duration, and we don't want that. We're probably going to try to make our bleeds last as long as possible so we could run around and do other things while our opponent is bleeding. Down here it says bleed damage is not reduced by armor, but will be reduced by any other source of physical mitigation such as endurance charges or immortal call. So if your opponents have endurance charges, your opponent will take less bleed damage. Bleed damage can be increased by the vulnerability hex and, like all damage over time effects, the despair hex. Okay, so these are 2 curses or 2 hexes that we could look into. Curses could be vulnerability. How do you spell the Nerability? Or what was the other one? Vulnerability or despair. Curses, vulnerability or despair. Now let's see what these do. The vulnerability hex, it will curse all targets in an area, causing them to take increased physical damage. Attacks against the cursed enemies have a chance to inflict bleed, and ailments inflicted on them will deal damage faster. So they will take increased damage, and your bleeds will deal its damage faster. Okay. So for vulnerability, increased damage deals damage faster. Now what does despair do? Curses all targets in an area, lowering their chaos resistance. We don't do any chaos damage. We're all physical damage. Bleed is not chaos. It is physical. Poison is chaos. Bleed is not. So we don't care about chaos resistances. And increasing damage over time they take. So they will also take increased damage over time. All hits will add chaos damage to the cursed enemies. Cursed enemies take 0.5% increased damage from damage over time effects. Base duration. Cursed enemies get negative chaos resistances. Cursed enemies take increased damage from damage over time effects. And it adds chaos damage to hits against cursed enemies. So you get flat chaos from this. Whoops. So despair is just, the only thing that will do for bleed is increased damage over time. So out of these 2, vulnerability also gives increased physical damage, but it deals damage faster. Increased physical damage. And it deals damage faster. Despair is just increased damage over time. All that other chaos stuff we don't care about. We don't care about chaos stuff. Dual wielding using cleave or dual strike, we don't care about that. Duration, here we go. The base duration of bleed is 5 seconds. Cool. Bleeds last 5 seconds. Let's see. Bleed lasts 5 seconds. So the base duration of bleed is 5 seconds. This means that by default and before reductions, see above, an attack that causes bleed will deal additional 350%, which is 70% for 5 seconds, over its full duration to a target that isn't moving. If the target is moving for the full duration, this increases to 1050%, which is 350% times 3. It's a multiplier. If Crimson Dance is allocated, this additional damage decreases to 175% per stack, regardless of whether the target is moving or not. So if you're fighting against stationary targets and the target is not moving, Crimson Dance is better. But there are different things that I'll go through later. For example, in Snaring Arrow, we'll have even stationary targets be like they're moving. I'll go through all that stuff later. Separate applications of bleed do not stack, so you cannot get stacks of bleed unless Crimson Dance is allocated. So you're not gonna get stacks of bleed unless you have Crimson Dance. Then it stacks up to 8 times. Cool. Each bleed effect remains present on the target until it runs its course. So all your damage is being dealt throughout 5 seconds. But if you're dealing your damage faster, I'm pretty sure that the duration of your bleed gets decreased. So that means it will deal its full amount of damage, but in less time. So if you hit, let's say 10,000 damage on a minion regularly, that 10,000 damage, the minion will take over 5 seconds. But if you're dealing damage faster, then he could still take that 10k damage, but he'll take it over 4 seconds. So that's what those other gloves do and stuff. Or the vulnerability curse, that's what it is. This vulnerability curse is you will deal your damage faster. And I don't know if we even like that if we're gonna attempt to use Crimson Dance. We might not. I don't know. I haven't gone through everything yet, but we can see. Crimson Dance being allocated for the build that we're gonna be doing, or that I'm gonna be playing at League Start, is gonna have to deal a lot with attack speed. If I can attack 8 times in 1 second, fucking great. Technically, I have 5 seconds to build 8 stacks before the first stack runs out. So, 2 times per second, that would be 4 seconds. That would be 8 stacks. So I would need minimum 2 attacks per second to allocate Crimson Dance. And even then, it would only be able to stack against bosses, and it would no longer deal extra damage if they were bleeding, which would allow us to cut out some things out of our build. I'm a very lazy player, and you'll see that in the future. But yeah, each bleed effect remains present on the target until it runs its course, but only the one with the highest damage per second will cause the damage. Cool. For example, assume the enemy is inflicted with bleed for 100 damage per second, then after 2 seconds it's inflicted with the bleed for 50 damage per second. The outcome will be 500 damage over 5 seconds, followed by 100 over 2 seconds. I don't know, maths. You lost me here. All I know is that the highest damaged bleed is going to deal the damage. That's all I need to know. Damage modifiers. As a damage over time effect, Bleed's damage can be effective positively or negatively by some damage modifiers. Cool. So the following modifiers will directly affect the damage of Bleed. And that's all we're looking for right now, is we're just trying to find different ways to scale the damage of Bleed. It says damage, physical damage, damage over time, and bleeding damage. Those are all different ways to scale physical damage. So what do we have here? We have physical damage. Let's just write just generic damage. Damage. Bleed damage, physical damage over time. Regular damage over time. Physical damage. And bleed damage. There we go. This is going to be the way we are going to scale our Bleed Bow Gladiator. We're going to look for these mods on gear that we're going to get damage off of. We're going to look for mods like damage. We're going to look for mods like physical damage over time. Oh, and physical damage. Oh, yeah, I have it down here. So bleed damage, physical damage, regular damage over time, physical damage over time, or just generic increased damage. Cool. Now we have our ways to scale our bleed damage. What else don't we know? Also, bleed is a non-elemental element, so damage from Ailments modifier will also affect the damage of bleed. Okay, so damage from Ailments is another way to scale bleed. Let's write that down. Damage from Ailments. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Actually, let me sit here and write these down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we have 6. To be honest, at this point, if you're still here with me in this video, congratulations, because I don't know how long this video is going to be, so we're probably going to be here for a while. Anyway, 6 ways scaling bleed damage. There we go. 6 ways to scale bleed damage right there. Flat physical attack damage modifiers being count in base attack damage also affects bleed damage. So flat physical attack damage, which I just put down for physical damage. But I don't know, let's add a, so let's go percent. We'll put percent physical damage, because that's what that means. Percent physical damage. Physical damage over time, cool. Bleed damage, damage from Ailments. And number 7 is flat physical damage. Now we have 7 ways to scale. Awesome. What else? Other modifiers of increased, reduced, more, less type affecting hits, which is attack, melee, ranged, projectile, as well as any damage modifiers specific to the skill do not apply to bleed. So attack damage will not apply to bleed. That is very good to know. Do not apply to bleed. 1 is attack damage. 2 is projectile damage. What is another one? Projectile, melee or ranged, as well as any other damage modifier specific to the skill. So to the skill that we're using. So actually do this is a reminder for myself, since these are notes that I'm taking right now for when the league launches. I'm going to tell myself, do not add anything into the build that is not above. There. And I'm going to put some stars to remind myself. Star, 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 star. So do not add anything into the build that is not above. And then I'm going to put 4 damage. There we go. That should remind me. So the only things that we can scale bleed damage with is generic damage, physical damage over time, percent physical damage, bleed damage, damage from ailments, and flat physical damage. Everything else does not matter. Everything else does not matter. That is very nice to know, because knowing myself, I probably would have gone into something like POB, and I would start randomly clicking on nodes, and if I came across some projectile nodes and it increased my damage, it would increase the damage of the attack I was using, maybe, but that does not increase the damage of bleed. And what we are trying to do is scale bleed. That is our thing. So everything else does not matter. I have to stick to these 7 if I want to scale my bleed damage properly. So this is what we're doing. Alright. Defense modifiers. Damage from bleed cannot be affected by mechanics affecting physical damage from hits, such as armor or fortified. Damage from bleed cannot be affected by mechanics affecting physical damage, such as armor or fortify. Right. The only things, and we had this from above, that will actually affect bleed, I believe, was endurance charges and immortal call. They told us already. Bleed damage is not reduced by armor. You will still take the same amount of bleed damage. So we knew this already. Damage from bleed cannot be affected by mechanics affecting physical damage from hits such as armor or fortify. To affect incoming damage from bleed, one needs, they're missing an S, one needs to use global hits and ailments or ailment damage reduction modifiers. Alright, so if you want to defend yourself from something like bleed, you'd have to use global bleed hits or ailments, I guess. We're not going to do that with our build. I haven't gotten to the defenses of our build yet. Right now, I'm just going through the bleed. Also, incoming damage from bleed can be affected by affecting attackers' base physical damage attack damage. With, for example, Lori's Lantern. What is this? Resistances, increased movement speed on low life. Damage from enemies hitting you is unlucky while you are on low life. So also incoming damage from bleed can affect by affecting attackers' base physical attack damage. So if you can lower your opponent's attack damage, knowing that bleed will inflict the highest hit, then you're lowering their highest hit of bleed they can inflict on you, if that makes sense. I guess that's what that is saying. Duration modifiers. So bleed's duration can be affected by the following modifiers: ailment duration and bleed duration. And bleed from puncture is also affected by debuff duration. Okay, so let's grab these 3. Also look for ailment duration, bleeding duration, And if using puncture, debuff duration. Awesome. Cool. I'm gonna know what all this means in the future. Because if we're gonna allocate Crimson Dance, we're not really gonna have a need for puncture. Unless we already have our 8 stacks. I don't know. We'll see. I don't know what we're gonna do with this yet. Removal and immunity, of course, you can get different flasks. The Death's Door, bleeding cannot be inflicted on you, which would go great if you are stacking armor for a bleed character, I guess, with the, where's that jewel at? The golden rule. So bleeding that you give others is inflicted onto you, which means that you are going to start taking damage because you are also now bleeding. But what these boots do, where are these boots at? Right here, the Death's Door. Bleeding can't be inflicted onto you. So, in order for you to use the golden rule, you would need to be bleeding, right? Yeah, while bleeding. So you need to be bleeding, and if you have these boots, then you can't use the golden rule. This carapace, bleeding cannot be inflicted onto you. You want to be bleeding, but you don't want to take damage from bleeding is essentially what you want. The bloodlust support, the blood grip. Moving while bleeding doesn't cause you to take extra damage. Cool, but you're still gonna take damage. Right here. Moving while bleeding doesn't cause you to take extra damage. 15% increased movement speed while bleeding and 50% chance to be inflicted with bleeding when you were hit by an attack. You don't even want these, the infinite pursuits. No. Because you're still going to take damage, you're just not going to take as much damage while moving, since moving while bleeding will cause you to take triple damage. It will kill you off pretty quick. What is this? These are different types of bleed gems. Double strike, lacerate, puncture, Val double strike, vulnerability is the curse. Pride as an aura. Nearby enemies take at least 19% more physical damage. But in order for you to use pride, English is hard. In order for you to use pride, you have to be next to nearby enemies. Is basically what that is saying. Is nearby is the key word in that whole sentence. If you're doing what I'm doing and you're kicking back with a bow, pride may not be the best for you because you're not going to have any nearby enemies in the first place. Malevolence is a skill that I can use because that will increase your damage over time. Let's roll through here and see. It actually gives you unique items that have to deal with bleed. Let's see if we like any of these unique items. We are going for bleed. What is this venopuncture? It adds 1 to 4 physical damage to attacks. Since it has numbers next to it, this is what they call flat damage. Flat physical damage. This is 1 to 4 flat physical damage. It will give you chance to cause bleeding if you're trying to cap your 100% chance. It gives you 60% increased damage with bleeding. And, increased damage, which is just regular damage, but it's increased damage with bleeding. Cool. But you were chilled while you were bleeding. Hopefully we will not be bleeding. Non-chilled enemies you inflict bleeding on are chilled. And bleeding enemies you kill with hits shatter. So this is a way for you to chill bleeding enemies. And if you don't know what chill does, chill slows them down, which could be used defensively in a build like this. There are a few things that this ring is missing, And the two major ones is there's no life roll and there's no resistances. But it is a great DPS ring because it's 60% increased damage with bleeding. And it also comes with a type of defense in chill. So let's write down item ideas. And then we'll type in unique. Veno, N-V-E-N-O, Venopuncture. It's not a bad ring. Venopuncture ring. Good. What else? The Infinite Pursuit. Bleeding, 50% chance to be inflicted with bleeding. No. The Crimson Storm. It gives percent increased physical damage. It gives increased critical strike chance. 50% chance to inflict bleeding on critical strike. Enemies you inflict bleeding on grant flash charges. It adds flat physical damage against bleeding enemies, and 50% chance to maim enemies on critical strikes with attacks. So basically what this bow is saying is that if you're going critical strike, you have a 50% chance to inflict bleeding on a critical strike. We don't even know if we're going to be going crit or not. But starting off, if I came over here to, let's go Path of Exile trade, and I typed in the Crimson, where's it at? What's it called? It's called the Crimson Storm. So the Crimson Storm Steelwood bow, and I hit search. It's a 5C bow. 5 chaos. It's probably gonna be more expensive while the league continues, but 5C, there's 8 chaos, there's 10 chaos, 10 chaos, 15, 15, 20, 20, and it gets into exalts, I guess. 40, 40, I guess. But if I can pick one up for cheap, like 5, I would pay 10, maybe even 15C for this bow. Maybe even 20. That's just me. Depending on what rolls it has, the most I would pay for no links, no socket, but just for the bow, it probably would be 20C. Maybe if I'm really desperate for a good bow, I'd go 40, but I would have to be desperate. So for the bow, the Steelwood, Crimson Storm. The Crimson Storm bow. Starting gear. There we go. This could be a starting bow. You would have to grind a little bit of currency to get it, but it would be a starting bow. Cool. What else is there? We're not going for gloves. We're not doing any of that. We're not doing any of that. None of those. The Hungry Loop consumes corrupted. Nope. Blood Grip adds physical damage. It has a life roll. Cool. Flask, moving while bleeding. Not very much. And then passive skills, whatever. Okay. Cool. So we have 2 items already in mind for the build. They're unique items. They are 2 unique items. One is the Crimson Storm, depending on how cheap it is, and the other one is the Venopuncture ring, depending on how much that is. How much is the Venopuncture? Path of Exile. It's still Expedition League. This is N League, so I'm pretty sure everything is cheaper. Let's just go to Standard and see how much it's going for on Standard. Venopuncture Iron Ring. How much is this going for? 3C, it's corrupted, but that doesn't matter. This one's not corrupted, 4C. This one's not corrupted, 5C, 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 7C, 10C. Fairly cheap ring. How long does this go on for? 10, 10, 10, 10, 14. A divine. So, I don't know. Again, probably 1 to 20C is what you're gonna look for to pay for this, while the bow's probably gonna be 1 to 40C, depending on how desperate you are. Two fairly cheap uniques. And that is everything that we're going to be doing for bleed damage. That's all we're gonna be looking for. Bleed damage. I'm going to... How long is this video? How long? I don't know, it doesn't say. Anyway, I'm going to end this video right here. This is how we're going to scale our bleed damage. And shortly after this video, I'm going to start probably looking for defenses. What are we going to do for defenses? We have the damage type. We know what type of damage we're going to be doing. We know how we're going to scale our damage. All this stuff is about damage. We know exactly what not to get. We do not get anything but these 7 ways to scale damage. Or maybe even ailment duration, damage from ailments, or bleed duration. If we're using puncture, we could use debuff duration. Other than that, nothing else matters. We even got some curses in mind. Vulnerability is a curse, probably would be great. Moving targets take increased damage. We already know that. Only physical damage can inflict bleed. You can get bleed, only inflict bleed. Bleed only is inflicted from attacks, and bleed lasts 5 seconds. We need 100% chance to bleed. And then two unique items for bleed: the Crimson Storm and the Venopuncture. Cool. This is going to be how we're going to scale our bleed damage right here. So if you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like the video, give it a thumbs down. If you want to see more PoE content like this, or me going and developing a way for a new build, hit the subscribe button or hit that notification icon, and you'll see more PoE content. I play other games also, so I might go MIA off of PoE content for some weeks to even some months, who knows. But the new league is coming up, and I'm trying to get stuff together. And this is how we are going to scale our bleed damage. This is exactly how we're going to scale it. Anyway, thank you all for watching. I'm probably going to get some stuff ready to scale defenses, the different types of defenses that we're going to have. And, yeah, I will see you all in the next video. Thank you for watching.